Hello, welcome everyone. I am Ragan Sutterfield, and I'm a associate rector here at Christ Episcopal Church, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this conversation with Amy Peterson. Amy, for those of you who don't know her yet, is a writer who works the intersection of faith, language, and culture, and her work has appeared in such places as the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and The Millions, among many other outlets. Amy's books include Dangerous Territory, a memoir that explores her misguided quest to save the world, and more recently, her book, Where Goodness Still Grows, Reclaiming Virtue in an Age of Hypocrisy, which Amy will be reading from this afternoon. Amy is currently a postulant in the Episcopal Church, which is, for those who don't know, just a fancy way of saying that she hopes to be ordained a priest in the church, and the church hopes she does too. To that end, she's currently studying at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. And though she's been away for a while now, Amy did spend a good bit of her growing up in Little Rock, where much of her family still lives. And I happen to have attended, I think, like ninth grade with Amy at a small Christian school. So Amy, it is so good to have you with us here at the Literary Festival, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Reagan. It's so good to be here. I'm so honored to be invited. Little Rock definitely has a special and lasting place in my heart. That's where I lived for junior high and high school. And then not only did we go to school together, but we also taught at that school together for a year later. So Little Rock is a place I love. In fact, right now I deeply wish that I could go get some tamales. What's the name of the tamale place?
There are multiple.
Oh, man. Or a popsicle. What's the place that I'm thinking of? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Like Pops or?
Yes, Little Pops. Anyway, that's where I'd love to be right now. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. Love Little Rock and all of its 6 bridges and its libraries. Today I'm going to read to you a little bit from the chapter called Kindness in my book, Where Goodness Still Grows, Reclaiming Virtue in an Age of Hypocrisy. It's kind of appropriate that this event ended up taking place deep in election season, because this book was really born out of my own wrestling with the way that I saw Christians responding to the 2016 election, particularly, growing up in Little Rock in the 90s and hearing a lot of Christian leaders express deep concern about the moral character of Bill Clinton. And then in 2015 and 2016, hearing those same Christian leaders not have deep concern about the moral character of Donald Trump just had some bells going off in my head. And so I had a lot of questions. What's going on here? When does virtue matter? How do we define virtue? Was there something missing in the way we defined virtue when I was growing up? So in this book, I take some virtues from my childhood, growing up in conservative evangelical circles, and I try to reimagine them in ways that are more expansive, that listen to different voices, and that see virtues not as kind of weapons to keep us in our place, but more as tools that can help us cultivate wisdom and expansive hospitality. So in this chapter on kindness, I'm going to read a little bit from the middle, so let me just set it up for you. I opened this chapter by talking about 2 different sort of summer campish experiences where I am praised for being kind. And as I reflect on that word kind, I have a very negative reaction, because in my mind, kindness is kind of like a soft, weak virtue for women, like the virtue of being a doormat, right? Just someone who doesn't cause any trouble, who doesn't make a fuss. And that's not who I wanted to be. So I started looking into kindness and how we actually define it. And what I found is that in the etymology, kindness is related to kinship and to inheritances. And that really kind of exploded the idea of kindness for me, that it's actually about recognizing sort of our shared humanity with all people and needing to expand our definition of family, of kinship, and then also looking at the ways that inheritances, particularly in the US, have reinforced socioeconomic boundaries rather than flattening them. And so I look at some ways that some studies that have been done that show that having a family inheritance is actually much more of an important predictor for like financial stability than having a college degree. And it looks at the ways that white families have greater and more common family inheritances passed down than Black families do. And that's a direct result of our legacy of slavery. So kindness then has already gotten me into thinking about kinship, who's our family, who we leave our money to, where our money came from. And then one day I read an article by an ecologist named Robin Wall Kimmerer. And this exploded kindness in a whole new way for me. So that's the part I'm going to read for you. Every morning while I'm waiting for the coffee to steep in the French press and toasting bagels for sleepy children, I watch the sky lighten over the cornfields east of my house. In the winter, there's little to see but the stars winking away. In spring, though, the robins and the barn swallows are back. The morning sky stacks layers of color over the farmland, and my kitchen fills with light that's warm and pink and gold. Until I was introduced to the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, it never occurred to me that kindness might have something to do with the way I related to this scene. Robin Wall Kimmerer, plant ecologist, writes about the way language shapes our understanding of kinship. Kimmerer mourns the loss of her ancestors' Potawatomi language, which white settlers tried to extinguish. Her grandfather spoke Potawatomi as a child, but when he was taken to Carlisle Indian School, he was forbidden to speak it. He and all the native children at the boarding school were only allowed to speak English. For Kimmerer, the loss of the language she should have inherited is not just personal. Potawatomi contains wisdom that humanity will lose if the language is lost entirely, truths not articulable in English. Composed primarily of verbs, it has words for states of being that have no English equivalents. You hear a blue jay, she writes, with a different verb than you hear an airplane. Distinguishing that which possesses the quality of life from that which is merely an object. Birds, bugs, and berries are spoken of with the same respectful grammar as humans are, because we are all members of the same family. Potawatomi is a language less interested in things, as English is, being mostly nouns, than in animacy. Potawatomi grammar gives dignity to all life forms. English, Kimmerer argues, does not. To make her point, she turns to pronouns. Using it to refer to plants and animals deprives them of their animacy. Using it allows humans to feel free to exploit the natural world without recognizing our relationship to it. Kimmerer wonders what would happen if we found a new expression that could be slipped into English as a replacement for it when we're talking about living things. And she suggests one, ki. In Potawatomi, a kibamadzuan means a being of the earth. And so she makes a pronoun out of that word, the first part, a ki. She creates ki. Ki clucks in the hen house. Ki curls up by my feet and wags Ki's tail. Ki rises from the fog over the lake in early morning. For plural, she suggests kin. Ki is spelled K-I, so kin, K-I-N. On the blueberry bushes, kin are ripening purple, and in the lake, kin flash silver through the water. She says, our words can be an antidote to human exceptionalism, to unthinking exploitation, an antidote to loneliness, an opening to kinship. If words can make the world, Can these two little sounds call back the grammar of animacy that was scrubbed from the mouths of children at Carlisle? She asks. Key is unlikely to enter regular English usage, and yet since I read about key and kin, I've found my perspective shifting. Now, when I stand in my kitchen waiting for the water to boil or the coffee to steep in the French press, I look out the glass door across the back fields and the scene is transformed. Frost tips the grass. Our cat, Luna, paws at the door. Geese honk, gracefully heading south. Now I see all of this as kin, animated by the same spirit that animates me. If God created all of this ex nihilo, simply spoke kin into existence, then certainly words have power. The word I use for these creations matters. And if God created humans not out of nothing, but out of the clay which God had spoken into being, then surely that frost-sparkled grass is my sibling too, born out of the dirt like I was. Such a thought skirts the edges of what was allowed in the Christianity I grew up with. It comes too close to being something we feared as much as secularism, a New Age philosophy. But to be clear, I don't worship the grass or the geese, and I'm not idealizing them. The poet Tennyson saw nature red in tooth and claw, and I see that in my backyard as well as in my human neighbors. We are all spoken into existence by God. We are all fractured by human failure, prone to violence and competition. I'm not worshiping the natural world. I'm recognizing our kinship, our shared status as created beings who are at once in need of redemption and able to praise our Creator. Kimmerer has helped me see this, and now that she has, I see that it's been in Scripture all along. Scripture speaks to our kinship with all created beings. God makes covenants not just with humans, but with all living creatures, birds, farm animals, and wild animals. God calls the stars by name. And God has compassion for all that God has made. And it's not only humans who need redemption, all creation groans waiting for it. Kindness requires us to learn how to exist with all living creatures and to admit how much ecological trouble we humans have created. Cultural theorist Donna Haraway suggests we must reconfigure the way we relate to Earth and all its inhabitants. The task, she writes, is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning how to live and die well with each other. We must make odd kin, she says, aligning ourselves with those creatures outside of our direct genealogical and biogenetic families, finding unexpected collaborations and connections because we will become with each other or not at all. If we hope to have an inhabitable planet for our children as an inheritance, we must begin to think even more expansively about who is our kin. Then there's a little section about a class I was teaching and bringing up these ideas to my students. And then this is how the chapter ends. Perhaps it's not too strong to say that the future of life on Earth depends on kindness. It depends on us waking up to kinships indigenous peoples could have taught us about had we been listening, and reconfiguring the human exceptionalism that has characterized Western culture. And it depends on us finding inventive ways to connect beyond our biological and biogenetic families, admitting our inheritances are not really ours, but ours to share. Theologically, our redemption is only possible through our kind Lord, through God making odd kin with humans, becoming like us so that we can become like God. When we let this truth take root in us, perhaps we will learn to find joy and purpose in every new kinship we discover. Like children, happy to be forging new friendships at summer camp, crowding onto rough wooden benches around the campfire, listening to the crickets and watching the stars.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with some questions, and I invite all of those who are joining us to offer whatever questions you have in the Q&A function here on Zoom. You can post those, and Amy and I can see them, and I'll try to facilitate those as best I can. But I love that that passage, and particularly that idea from Donna Haraway of making strange kin. That language really appeals to me. But I also find myself, when I was reading that, I was thinking, I'm okay with the strange kin. It's the more familiar kin that are often a little bit harder to work through those relationships, and particularly in this kind of fraught political time. And so I wondered, for you, what, this book is such a creative reimagining of your inheritances, the language that you've inherited, but also the kinds of faith that you've inherited, but re-narrating it in different ways. So I wonder, in your experience of doing that, how has that helped, or what practices have helped you in dealing with all kinds of kin, both the strange ones and the more familiar ones?
Yeah, I kind of addressed that exact issue earlier in the chapter when I talk about the realization that, kindness shows us that God became our kin. So like, I'm the sister of Jesus, right? Also means that I have to recognize my kinship with like that guy at the soccer game who was wearing too much cologne, and the woman at the park who was flirting with my husband, and the kid who punched my kid in the playground, people who I don't necessarily find a lot of joy in like trying to find my kinship with. And yeah, I think for a lot of us, our biological kin, our families and extended families, conversations with them about things have become pretty volatile, and it's been hard sometimes to find common ground. I think with the people we should have the most sort of natural common ground with, it's become very difficult in some cases. So what practices have I found that have helped me deal with that? Is that the question? Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know that there's like one answer. It kind of depends on the relationship. But who all is on this call? Who's listening to me tell these secrets from my family stories? In the last couple of months, my grandmother has been sending me a lot of fake news forwards. And in the past, I've pretty much just ignored those. And sometimes that's the right thing to do for a relationship, right? To just ignore things that maybe you're not going to succeed on finding common ground in, and focus on where you do have common ground. She loves my daughter, her granddaughter, that's some great common ground we have. She loves me too. but in the past few months, I've started responding to almost all of the fake news things that she forwards me. And I will try in just a really short, simple way to point to why this is fake. And then the last time she did it, I followed that up with a couple lines that were just like, I'm happy to talk about this stuff with you, but I would so much rather hear how the choir at church is going, and have you gotten to meet my cousin's newest baby yet? And just sort of like try to turn and focus in on that place. I think our best hope for changing minds is to be connected in our hearts. So that's part of what I've been doing.
That's helpful. And so much of your book begins with this. I love the language of apocalypse that you use in the introduction, and this the more correct understanding of apocalypse in terms of an unveiling. And I'd love for you to talk about what that unveiling was for you, and I think how do you read this shift in your understanding of evangelicalism and kind of the surprise that you felt in the kind of political turn that you've witnessed? And do you think that that's rooted in fundamentally in a theological problem that was always there, or is it something that is a perversion of? I mean, is it a natural outgrowth or is it a perversion? I guess is part of what I'm asking.
Yeah. Let me take the second part of that question first. I'm by no means an expert on that, but I do want to point to some other books that have come out recently that I think are really helpful in understanding what has happened with Christianity and politics. One is by Jack Jenkins. I think it's called American Prophets. It just came out maybe last month. And the other one is by Kristen Kobe's Dumez, and that's called Jesus and John Wayne. And those are just a couple of books. There's several others too, but there have been a number of good books on this recently that really go into more historical depth than I can go into. So I can recommend those. As for my own apocalypse, I did want to title this book Virtues for the Apocalypse, but my publisher was afraid people would think it was like a book about the actual end times and like, I don't know, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse or something. So they didn't go for it. For me, actually this week we celebrated the anniversary of the release of the Pussy tapes, where we got to hear Trump using some really terrible language to describe with great joy his abuse of women, right? And I think I tend to mark that moment as when those tapes were released, that was the beginning of the apocalypse for me, because so much of the virtues I had been taught were about faithfulness, marriage, family, fidelity, purity, modesty, and especially those when some of those virtues were taught in a sort of gendered way. Christians were saying that they were using these virtues in a gendered way to protect me as a woman, right? And then here we had a predator speaking proudly about his predation, and no one cared about his virtues, and no one cared about protecting me as a woman. And so I think it should have clicked for me before that. I mean, when Trump called Mexicans racists, or when he mocked the disabled reporter at one of his rallies, or some of those rallies in 2016, he was using like textbook pre-genocidal language to refer to immigrants. Any of those things should have been the apocalyptic moment for me, but it really didn't hit home until it sort of hit me personally as a woman. And as I worked through what was revealed to me through that, I mean, you could say it was revealed to me that some of these leaders had always been more interested in policing and controlling me and my body than in my actual virtue or anyone's actual virtue. But I don't think that that's quite fair, because a lot of the Christian leaders who taught me these things, I think, were really good-hearted and wonderful people. I think that what was revealed to me there was a problem of limiting who we listen to. And I think that in our understanding of virtue, we have pretty much consistently listened to one kind of voice, a white, Western, male, upper middle class, high, whatever, voice. And that has limited our ability to understand these virtues in a variety of contexts and in a pluralistic world. So for me, part of the solution is actually to listen more expansively to other voices as we think about what these virtues are. And I do want to say that I think the problem that's been revealed is a problem within Christianity, but it's also a problem that's about Christian nationalism becoming misidentified with Christianity.
That's helpful. So there, again, I invite others to jump in with questions here, but I'm wondering, some of the representations of Christian nationalism kind of, I think, really came to a lot of people's attention with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, since you're such an attentive, so attentive to language, thinking about the difference between morality and virtue, because those are two things that I think are often conflated. But I think you offer us a nuanced difference, and I'd like to hear you speak to that.
I think, I'm not an ethicist by any means. Am I going to just qualify every answer by I'm not an expert? Morality to me is about character, and virtues are the tools that we use to build character. So, and one thing that I think is important to note is that the word virtue actually comes from the Latin word vir, which means man. So our word virtue basically means like manliness. And depending on who's defining manliness, that can be a real problem.
Yes. Well, one of the passages in your book that I really loved was, you explore a change in, all of each chapter is kind of this turning of a particular virtue, but your chapter on modesty hit home because it reflected a lot of my own experiences at a Christian college, and you speak about working at a Christian college and the conversations around modesty there, and but you offer a very different perspective on what modesty is. And so just to help our audience get a little bit of a flavor of the how you shift the understandings, and each of your chapters does this. Can you talk a little bit about modesty as you've seen it expressed within the Christian upbringing that you had, and then modesty as you've come to understand it as the way that the actual scriptures understand it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you mentioned that I talk about being at a Christian college, and it's maybe important to note that while I wrote this book, I was employed at a Christian liberal arts college in the Midwest. I taught some, and I worked with honor students there. And so part of why my apocalypse happened the way it did, I think, is because I was so pretty deeply entrenched in an evangelical community. And so a lot of things were hitting home pretty close for me. And so, yeah, a lot of this book sort of takes place in the rural Midwest, with a sort of Christian college in the background. So modesty, I grew up definitely hearing that modesty was a virtue for women, and it was a virtue about covering our bodies and how much skin was appropriate to show. We had, rules at our private Christian school about what we could wear, how long our shorts needed to be, how thick our straps on our tank tops needed to be. And that's what modesty was. It was about how much of your body is covered by clothing, how much skin is showing. And I don't actually think that has anything to do with how modesty is defined in the Bible. So there were a couple of scriptures that were often used in those discussions in youth group or whatnot about modesty, and girls, you need to dress modestly to protect your brothers, was basically the way that was framed. And they would say that it was about protecting the weaker brother, which I go into that a little bit in the book, but that's pretty kind of taking the verse out of context. The word modesty in scripture is the Greek word cosmos, which, as you can hear, is related to the world, the cosmos, and is also related to order. And that word doesn't appear very often in Scripture, but where it does appear, it's talking about removing, let me find the exact verse so that I'm not just going on and on here. So when we're looking at, it's 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 10. And it says, the women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. So this was the verse that I might have heard in youth group saying that modesty is about women covering up their bodies. In fact, what's going on here is, as the verse goes on, it says, not with braided hair and gold and pearls or costly attire. Braided hair. Why braided hair, right? What's that about? Well, in the ancient world, having elaborate braids was a sign of wealth. It meant that you were like a person of leisure who had free time to get your hair done, and you probably employed a servant or had an enslaved person who did your hair in these elaborate braids for you, right? So what this verse is actually talking about, braided hair, gold, pearls, costly attire, is showing off wealth. It's not about showing off skin. It's warning women, don't let your wealth create some barrier between you and other people that might keep them from coming to church because they feel embarrassed or ashamed or not good enough. So modesty is actually about removing barriers that your own power or wealth can create to other people coming to church or to know Jesus. And so, yeah, beauty might be one of those sort of like strengths that you have, that if you flaunt it, it could create a barrier. But that's not the main one that the scriptures are concerned about. The main one they're concerned about is wealth. And actually, I think that's much more convicting in the American church, because we may not be like driving to church in cars that cost $100,000, Teslas. We may not be dripping in diamonds when we come to church, but we are pulling out our smartphones that were made with minerals that were possibly mined by children, right? We're a very wealthy church. And I think there's a lot of work for us to do there in thinking through how we can not let that wealth be a barrier to anyone else.
Thank you, Amy. There's so recently I was traveling through a rural part of Arkansas and Missouri, and a lot of farm country and a lot of Trump signs. And there's this kind of understanding that maybe some of the people who are in these rural places have felt a kind of resentment from kind of an urban liberal elite that and that part of the evangelical signing on with Trump has been kind of a feeling like no one's really heard them, and that Trump has. And so we have a question on kind of how do we think about kindness without, while avoiding this throwing the white male Midwesterner under the bus. So how do you think about that?
Well, you begin exactly by recognizing your kinship with the white male Midwesterner who has the Trump sign in his yard. And that is an easier thing for some of us to do than for others for a lot of reasons, many of them valid, right? But I think that that's something that every Christian is called to do, is to recognize our kinship, even with those people with whom we deeply disagree, and also recognize the image of God in those people. And I think that's where we begin. We're not called to change their minds so much as we are called to love them. And I think that kindness is also pretty deeply connected to humility. And humility means approaching every person, understanding that you can learn from them, and I mean, as you know better than I do, Reagan, humility is related to hummus. It's about being close to the earth and the soil, right? And so that Midwestern farmer may know a few things you don't know about humility and kindness. So you can start there.
You're someone who I think has used some social media tools like Twitter really well. So thinking about that conversation, kind of jumping from that question, and for some people, it's like Twitter and social media are like the end of all conversation, and then others are like, no, they can be really positive tools. And since they do play such a big role in our contemporary politics, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that, and
Sure.
how, and particularly how you try to practice these virtues online, because I think that's a question that a lot of us could use some help with.
That's a great question. Yeah. Um, I'm glad to hear you say that I practice these well. I'll tell my husband that you said that next time he thinks I need to get offline. um, Twitter was a game changer for me because after Ferguson happened, that was what, like 2014? I think that's when it was. I started intentionally following Black people on Twitter, basically. People who were talking about life experiences that were very different than mine. And I followed some activists. I followed Black theologians. I just kind of kept my my eyes open for anybody who was speaking thoughtfully and displaying sort of a perspective on the world that I can't get from my place as a middle class straight white woman in the South, right? So that really opened my eyes. And I still try to follow a pretty wide variety of voices, conservative and liberal, on Twitter, so that I'm not just in an echo chamber. And that's something I'm really intentional about. At the same time, if somebody's a troll, I just block them and don't give it a second thought. And then Facebook, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie The Social Dilemma yet. I have not. I'm too afraid to. But I'm pretty sure that after the election, I'm going to delete my Facebook profile. But until the election, I'm committed to posting on a very regular basis on Facebook, because I really think that a lot of my friends and family members are getting most of their news, and I mean, a fair amount of their spiritual formation from Facebook. And because of the way the algorithms work, they're ending up with a lot of fake news, QAnon conspiracy theories, really troubling things populating their feed. And so I'm intentionally committed to posting things that are true and good and beautiful on Facebook from now until the election, as a way to try to counteract that, just to make sure that their feed is not 100% fake news and QAnon, and instead has like maybe some little, if I can defeat the algorithm, some little bursts of truth or goodness or beauty coming into it. But I think Facebook is a pretty problematic place to be right now. Instagram has also been sort of an interesting place for social activism in the last six to 12 months, especially. And I'm not quite sure where I land on that one. I've seen some of the same Facebook issues happening there, especially with white female influencers who are influencing by spreading conspiracy theories. But then also, like, a lot of my former college students, I follow them on Instagram, and they are like sharing facts about the school to prison pipeline and like all kinds of things. So I'm definitely seeing like some people waking up via Instagram as well. So I mean, like anything, they are tools that can be used for good and evil, but I do think that's really important to be intentional and thoughtful about how we use them.
One of my kind of things that I walked away from your book with is a new way of thinking about parenting.
Mm.
And because so much of your book is both about, your experiences as a child and the kind of formation that you received, good and bad, and how that's informed your adult understandings. But then you also talk about being a mother and the way that you engage with your children. And two things that particularly struck me in your discussions of parenting were one, acknowledging your children's lament without saying that everything has to just be okay. And even if they're crying over sandwiches cut the wrong way, or the lack of space for a recording studio in your home, or that you want to acknowledge grief and not just say everything's going to be rosy, which I found really helpful. But then also you talked about, in kind of that Donna Haraway phrase of staying with the trouble, of reading Bible stories to them, just straight through all the like confusing mess that can be the Bible, and not trying to put a lot of, nice spin on it. And doing that as opposed to the kind of book of virtues that you grew up with that had a kind of very one-dimensional moral understanding. So there's a lot of talk about virtue education. It seems that you're engaged in a certain kind of virtue education, but maybe different from what a lot of the virtue education that we hear about. So can you talk about how you're educating your children into the virtues, and how that influences your own education into the virtues?
That's funny. After I finished this book, I was talking to my agent about what I was going to do next, and he said, "Have you ever thought about a parenting book?" And I was like, "No, absolutely not." For many reasons, but I guess this. I want to talk a little bit about both of those moments you brought up, but I also want to say that I think. This connects to like the way that I view parenting that's different from maybe virtue education, is that I see virtue as less about teaching kids to like stay within a certain set of boundaries and follow the rules. I mean, at times that's important, but I see parenting as less about that and as more about helping them cultivate the habits and the tools that they need to act with character and integrity in the world. And so again, virtues aren't necessarily some set static thing, but they're kind of dynamic and changing, and you have to understand the context. And so you'll be able to act virtuously if you have a character formed that helps you understand the context and think things through. So on the Bible stories part, I just think that in the Book of Virtues, which I talk about in the first chapter of this book, the Book of Virtues was this collection of like moral tales and fables. It was published in the 90s by William Bennett, who's a kind of Republican operative guy. And they include a few Bible stories in the Book of Virtues, but they choose versions that are really cleaned up. They take out a lot of the pathos and the questions and the real emotions. And I think that's really dangerous, because kids look at the world and see quite clearly that it's a morally complex place. Things are not always simple and clear. And so I think that the Bible stories that show that ring true to kids. And that's part of why I do that. But I also do that almost so that they see that morality isn't always simple and clear, right? And God isn't always simple and clear, and that's okay. And you can respond to God in all kinds of ways, including lament. And so, yeah, I mean, those are true stories. Like my son at one point cried because I cut his sandwich into triangles instead of rectangles. And my daughter, almost the same week, started crying because we didn't have room for her to build her own recording studio in the house. I'm making a really intentional choice to not say in those kinds of situations, stop crying, that's stupid, right? But instead to let them like cry. If they're sad, they should cry. And I think that that is an emotion that's turned off in a lot of evangelical or Christian communities, because we're afraid that sadness and lament are signs that we're not being faithful to God or that we're doubting God. When in fact, throughout Scripture, lament it's all through Scripture, the Psalms and Lamentations and Job and even Jesus wept, right? I mean, lament is one way to respond to the evils of the world. And if we turn that off, we're going to lose our ability to see what's evil in the world. Actually, lamenting what is wrong in the world helps you gain a kind of moral vision for looking at the world. When you lament something that's wrong, then you're able to think about, what could I do to fix it, right? And so if my son laments that his sandwich is cut in the wrong way, then we can work together to find a solution, right? And hopefully that translates later into, if my son is lamenting that there's a bully in his class, he can tell me about it and express his sadness, and we can work together to find a way to help fix that situation. And then maybe later it translates into, if you realize that most of your clothes are coming from factories in Asia that are sweatshops where children are working or where no one's paid a living wage, you can lament that instead of just ignoring it, because your practice of lament throughout your life has helped you gain a moral vision and clarity, and helped you see that if we lament something that's wrong, that's the first step towards being able to imagine a different way. I get a little bit carried away about lament. I can say more about lament if you want, or if there's another question, we can go on.
So here's another question. So Sherry asks, as someone who's raised out of the Christian faith, I have a lot of trouble understanding how evangelists who are reportedly steeped in the Bible can support a president who is so obviously harmful to others, uncaring of others, and how he can possibly learn to love those who support his practices and prejudices.
Yeah, I mean, that's the heart of it, Sherry, exactly. I mean, that feeling of I can't understand how these people could support this man is the motivation for my book. And I think one thing we have to do is remember the complexity of each human person, the stories of their life that we don't know, the battles they're fighting that we know nothing about, and not reduce them to a person who has one political view or supports one politician, right? That's very tempting and very easy for me to do. And so it is a practice, it's something I have to work on to instead sort of like stop my gut reaction and remind myself, this is a whole person, not reducible to one viewpoint, but a person who has a wealth of experiences and inputs and relationships that I don't fully understand. And so if you can try to see that person as a beautifully complex creature made in the image of God and start from there, that's sort of the best thing I know how to do. But I do want to be clear that there are times to cut off relationship. I mean, if we're talking about someone who's an abuser, or someone who sort of will only talk to you about this one thing and nothing else. I mean, I think there's a time to give up. Jesus, when he sent out his disciples, he said, if they don't welcome you in the town, then leave and shake the dust off your feet as you leave. I think that there's a time in our relationships for that to happen sometimes. But as much as we can, I think we try to embrace humility and remember the complexity of every human person and look for some point of common ground.
Amy, we're nearing the end of our time together, and you end your book with a chapter on hope, and some and chickens, and this book was finished before the pandemic, and so I wonder for you now, where you're finding hope, and how you, and if there's where you're finding hope, but also if there's anything that you would change, or maybe if you were to add an addendum to the book from the experiences over the last few months, if there's anything new that's arisen for you.
That's interesting. I think that hope is based in action. And so hope isn't just like a sort of wishful thinking, but we actually can cultivate hope in our lives by taking action. And a wonderful book I read in the last year, after this book was finished, is a little book by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark. And she looks at some political changes that have happened over the last, 50 years, and sort of traces these like very small events, very small like works of activists in very local sort of pockets, and how it's like the butterfly effect, right? Like what we have now came from a lot of small things happening around the globe that most people were not aware of. And she sort of points to some specific examples of that as how political change works. And when I read that was really helpful to me. And I think that I have noticed in my own life that when I act, I feel more hopeful. So there are things I've done in the last couple of years that I had never done before. Like I phone banked for a candidate. I walked around my neighborhood registering voters or helping people check their voter registration. I've called my state representatives, which I had never done before. They're very small actions, but when you actually do them instead of just doom scrolling Twitter all day, it really does help cultivate some hope for you. I don't know that the pandemic has, I don't know. I kind of want to throw that question back to you, Ragan. What have you learned about hope in the pandemic?
Well, I think that one of the things the pandemic has offered for myself and many people that I know is a slowing down and an ability to look around and pay attention. Just the amount of wildlife that my family's seen in our own yard over the last 6 months, it's been amazing, and it's because we're there more and we're paying attention. So have you had experiences like that?
Yeah, it's been exactly the same for us. I mean, when the pandemic hit in March, because all my work got moved to home, right? So I had to move my desk to a different spot, and it was right in front of a window. And right outside that window, there was a bird's nest. And I got to watch these cardinals tend their nest and lay eggs, and then the eggs hatched, and then I watched the baby cardinals get fed, and then I watched them learn to fly. And we got an app on my phone that helps us identify all the plants in our yard. And so I had the kids take my phone and go outside and identify as many plants as they could, and then draw a map of our yard and label all the plants. So yeah, we've absolutely been tuning in more to our own backyard and been slowing down. And I'm an introvert, so actually all the staying home isn't that hard for me. I kind of feel glad that I don't have to make up excuses to skip social events anymore. just pandemic. Sorry, I really wish I could. Yeah, I'm hopeful that this isn't the end. And, I guess that's the other thing. I think that the pandemic slowed us all down enough that we paid more attention when what happened to George Floyd happened, and slowed us all down enough that more people were able to participate in protests. And I think that I'm hopeful that this slowdown that we won't go back to normal after this, but that this slowdown has in fact given us a pause that would allow us to recalibrate some things and to choose differently when we do go back to whatever the next normal will be. I hope it will be different in some ways.
I think that's helpful. Well, to close us out, I want to ask you one of the questions I always love to ask writers, which are, who else should we be reading? So who are some of the people that those of us who have come to hear you should also be listening to?
I love to answer this question. Just right now, I'm reading this book on immunity by Eula Biss. And a lot of what I write about in my purity and hospitality chapters, actually, and kindness too, really kind of resonates with what Eula Biss wrote here in 2010 about, and it's like so perfect for this moment because it's about immunities and how our bodies respond to viruses. And it's beautifully written. So I highly recommend that. Also, I think you should look for The Myth of the American Dream by Danielle Mayfield. DL, she writes as DL Mayfield. Especially if you're trying to understand sort of like what happened politically, the relationship between evangelicals and politics, and how to live and what to value. The Myth of the American Dream by D.L. Mayfield. And then my friend Kelly Nikondeha wrote a book called Defiant that came out this year, which takes a really close look at the female characters in the first chapters of Exodus. So you have Miriam, you have the princess who adopts Moses, you have the midwives, and she does some really great biblical exegesis, narrative exegesis, storytelling about those women. And it's very empowering as we go into this election season and think about what we can do and how we can act and how we can defy the pharaohs of our own day. So that book is Defiant by Kelly Nikondeha. And if you're at all interested in the stuff we've talked about today, I think all three of those books would be right up your alley.
Those sound like great recommendations. And I know that D.L. Mayfield is a fellow failed missionary, correct?
That's right, yeah. We have a lot in common. Yeah, her first book is that in the subtitle of her first book? It's like Reflections on Faith from a Failed Missionary or something. Yeah. She's a great writer and a great friend.
Well, where can people find more about your work? And just those from Little Rock, by the way. Your book, last I checked, was at Wordsworth Books here in Little Rock. So anyone who would like to pick up a copy of Amy's book,
support Wordsworth. And if you're not in Little Rock, Indie Bound. You can find my book at Indie Bound and support your local independent bookstore. I also like to recommend Hearts and Minds books. If you don't have an indie bookstore that you support, try Hearts and Minds books or Eighth Day Books. Those are great bookstores who will help you find any books that you're looking for. They're really, really great people there. You can find more about me at my website, amypeterson.net. You can follow me on Twitter at Amy L. Peterson or on Instagram at AmyPete. And I think that's all you need to know.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us virtually here at the Six Bridges Book Festival, and hope that when your next book comes out, we can all get to come see you in person.
I hope so too. I'm sad that we're not all going out to the Heights Taco and Tamale Company right now. That's where I want to be going. Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And there was a question about one of the books that Amy recommended was On Immunity by Eula Biss. That was the first one. And but thank you all for being here, and we'll hope you enjoy the rest of the literary festival.